Hey everybody. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Jen MacLean. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Executive Director of the IGDA and IGDA Foundation. And I need you to indulge me if I seem very excited because I'm also very jet lagged and I am running on a lot of caffeine right now. Many of you probably know the IGDA, the International Game Developers Association. We're the largest professional association for game developers in the world. We have over 120 chapters, including a number right here in Australia, and Melbourne is one of our leading chapters. And the IGDA Foundation is not anywhere near as well known. And that is sad to me because the IGDA Foundation exists specifically to build a more diverse and inclusive game development community. And here's the thing, I love games. I love games. I've loved them since I was 7 and I had an Atari 2600. And I want every single person in the world to love games too. And I think that the way we make that happen is to have a game development community that is welcoming and inclusive of any person who wants to make games. No matter what their gender is, no matter how old they are, no matter what the color of the skin is, no matter where they live, no matter who they love, I want anyone who wants to make games feel welcome and included in our community. And that's really what the goal of the foundation is, and I can't think of a better goal for us all to work towards. So this workshop is based on work that was originally done by the ADA Initiative. The ADA Initiative is a nonprofit foundation in the United States that was originally created to help bring more women into computer science. And the IGDA Allies Special Interest Group took the workshop. They modified it a little bit, incorporated some game development experiences, and then we expanded it even further. So you're gonna see a little bit of that here, as well as some other information on bias. A lot of it's taken from Google's anti-bias training, and you can find that training online. It's really interesting to watch. And I hope some of the content is going to come from you, because it's going to be a lot more interesting if you stop and ask questions. If you say, I'm not sure about that, can you tell me more about that? Please don't feel like you have to hold your questions to the end. It's going to be a much more enjoyable time if we are all involved and active and participate. How many of you hear bias and start to feel a little bit defensive? It's pretty natural. I hear, Jen, you know, you're biased against people who like cats instead of dogs. I have a cat, come on. I have a dog and my dog is better, but I have a cat. But here's the thing, as people, we are biologically wired to have biases. They are what have allowed us to survive this long. And when we get defensive about hearing that we have a bias, and every single person in this room has bias, it's how our brains work. That means that we can't overcome our bias. That means that we can't stop and challenge ourselves, and that we can't act as great allies to other people. And fundamentally, it stops us from building that community where everyone is welcome and included and making games. And I'm going to share some interesting examples of how bias can be even more harmful. In the United States, there is a really big problem with the gender of professional musicians and orchestras. It's very, very male, even more male than the game development community. So a few of the leading orchestras in the United States moved to blind auditions. What that means is that there was a screen so that the people evaluating the musician couldn't see them. And immediately in one season, the number of professional musicians who identified as female in those orchestras went from 10% to 35%, immediately, because of a screen where someone couldn't see their gender. One of the examples that I really love, because I think this is a great example of insidious bias, is that when YouTube first launched on iPhones, long time ago before the screen auto-rotated, they only had right-handed developers. So for about 10 to 15% of their users, the videos would play upside down because they didn't account that someone who is predominantly left-handed holds their phone with a different orientation than someone who's right-handed. Really obvious, right? But when you don't see your own bias, You don't appreciate how it impacts your product and your customer and our players. A more sobering example is a study that was done where identical resumes were sent out. The only piece of information that changed was the name on the resume. And so for resumes where the applicants' names were Brandon, Greg, Emily, and Anne, it took 9 resumes to be sent out to get an interview request. When the names were Tamika, Aisha, Rashid, and Tyrone, it took 15 resumes to get an interview request. The exact same resume. One thing that Google did, because they are Google and they love data, is they actually set up a simulation to measure the impact of bias. And so they took male and female candidates and gave them a rating score, a performance score that reflected a range. And because you have your top performers, your middle performers, your lower performers, they had the same score. And then for male candidates, they increased those scores by 1%, just 1%. And they simulated what happened over the course of someone's career. So 8 different career promotional cycles. And where they started out 50-50 in level 1, by the time you got to level 8, no change other than 1% addition to male candidates. Your percent of women in that pool went down to 35%. How many of you think that when you see somebody you like, maybe it's because they're also a dog person, or they also like strategy games, or they're from your hometown? How many of you think you might be 1% more favorable towards them? Or maybe even a lot more, I don't know about you, but when I hear somebody who also loves BioWare and Mass Effect, I'm like, yeah, that person's really cool. I want to hang out with you. Don't get me started on what I did when I found out David Gatter was speaking last year. That's because we're inherently biased. And we create systems in our lives and in our careers that perpetuate that bias. And so we're going to talk today about how we can break those systems and specific actions that we can all take to be better allies and to break that bias and to really help create this community that we all want, where we all feel welcome and valued and included and special, because we are. One of the things that I like to look at is how we start bringing people into our game development community. So there's more and more discussion about gendered keywords in job applications or job listings. Text.io has a really great service. Unfortunately, it's also very expensive. That will go through your text, whether it's a description of a job or a description of your company, and identify gendered keywords. And it's really interesting to look at the different companies and how gendered their typical job descriptions are. Slack, for example, has made a real effort to promote more gender diversity and inclusivity. Other companies have been a little bit further behind the times. And I pulled a job description, a real job description from a company that I did a hiring workshop for. And I want to go through some things in that job description that are really good and that are really problematic, because it is also a great way to show in a very tangible, factual example how our biases are being spread in our community and how we are inadvertently creating a problem. So if you look at the first bullet point, this to me is exactly what a job description should say, because it boils down the heart of what you want this person to contribute, right? You're looking for a designer with experience architecting fun, accessible, and deep games and play experiences for a variety of different types of gamers. All right, that's really good. The second bullet point, passionate about product, and I removed the names to protect the not so innocent, and excited to be part of designing its future. If we only hire people who love what we make, are we potentially missing a chance to take in some critical feedback? And this is for a collectible card game. So if you are, say, the Pokemon company and you only hire people who love Pokemon, are you missing something? I think the not technical term there is eating your dog food. Third bullet point, experienced in a game design role in the game industry for a minimum of 3 years. So I have a question. How many people, when you hit your 3-year anniversary, have woken up different? You wake up and you know all the answers. No, you don't. And if you have a designer who has that experience architecting the fun and accessible gameplay that you want to see, do you really care if they have 2 years and 10 months of experience? No, of course you don't. But when you add that must have 3 years, you are actually creating a wall. You're creating a barrier. You are discouraging people who could have exactly the type of skills you want from applying for no reason at all. Let's look even further. Someone who considers themselves a gamer and is always thinking about games and game systems, does that apply to anyone in this room? No, it doesn't. Of course not. And for myself, I think I would be very upset if my partner was always thinking about games and game systems. They'd be really boring. That's, again, something that might sound good, but when we think about the teams we want to work on, we don't want a team that is always thinking about game systems. We want a team that has different passions and different interests and cares about more than collectible card game buffs, because they are the people that we want to spend time around. A great communicator, that's great. Comfortable leading teams, that's great. Knowledgeable about the landscape of contemporary TCG, CCG, fine. But this really gets to how we don't think about how the language that we use manifests. And it goes back to passion. So many people will say, I want to hire somebody who is passionate about what I'm building, without thinking about what that means. Does that mean that somebody is going to encourage bad work habits? Does that mean that they are going to be so attached to their vision that they can't take and receive criticism or receive and give criticism? If you say in your job description that you want someone who will do whatever it takes to ship this game, does that mean you want them to lie? Just to steal? To cheat? Do you want them to harass somebody out of their job instead of putting them on a performance improvement plan? Because guess what? When you say you want someone who will do whatever it takes, you are saying all of those things are okay. And it's really not. This type of language perpetuates our bias. And what that means is that fundamentally, we are making ourselves more stupid. That sounds really harsh, but being around people who are different from us, being around a group where there are 2 or more visible points of diversity, increases your IQ by 15%. And you know why? I'm sorry, not 15%, 15 points. And here's why. When we see visible diversity, we force ourselves to think more. We don't accept those biased shortcuts that we often find ourselves falling into, say, when you're in a room with your 3 best friends. Yeah, you aren't as careful with the language that you choose. You aren't challenging your assumptions. When we are in a homogeneous group, we fall back to shortcuts. And there's some really interesting research that has been done on homogeneous juries versus diverse juries. A homogeneous jury will reach a decision more quickly, with less disagreement, that is more likely to be wrong. And you see that play out in the workplace as well. So when we think about bias, when we think about why diversity and inclusivity are so important, it is because at the end of the day, I think we all want to be the best version of ourselves. And the way to help make that happen is to be surrounded by people who are different, who bring some unique point of view, some unique experience, some unique perspective that we don't have ourselves. So we like to talk about diversity a lot, but diversity is only part of the conversation. I'm curious, how many of you, when you were children, went to a party and were told, yeah, I only invited you because my mom made me? Anybody else? Yeah, see? When you hear that, it makes your heart ache. And that's why diversity is not enough. It's not enough to say, we want a diverse group of people in this room. If you say, okay, cat people, you're going to sit over there and I'm not going to talk to you because clearly you're a cat person. That's not okay. They're not included. And if you have diversity without inclusivity, that means that you are putting window dressing on. You are not taking advantage of the wonderful differences and perspectives and new points of view and new information that people are bringing to you. If you have diversity without inclusivity, you cannot be an ally. Curious, anybody want to throw out a definition of what you think an ally is? I told you it's going to be audience participation. Anybody? Anybody? Ally? You are not being good allies.
Someone who shares a similar understanding or point of view to you? Maybe not point of view necessarily, but can sympathize with you?
Yes, can sympathize, can empathize. That's a really great point. Thank you. Anybody else? What's an ally?
A supporter.
A supporter, yeah, really good.
Listens and signal boosts the voices of others.
Yes, signal boosts the voices of others listened. And that signal boosting often comes at the expense of their own voice. They are using their own voice to signal boost others. Anybody else want to talk about allies? What's an ally? An ally advocates for people who experience barriers beyond their control. And allies often do this at the expense of their own self-interest. And what that means is that we can all be allies. We can all advocate for people who are experiencing barriers beyond their control. It doesn't mean that only men can be allies. It doesn't mean that only women can be allies. And it doesn't mean that only men or only women experience these barriers, because we all experience them at different parts of our life. It also means that we all need allies, because we will all at some point in our life experience a barrier beyond our control. And that's why allyship is so important, because when we work together, we are stronger. Now, a lot of people hear allyship and they think, I don't really know if I need that. Let's just treat everybody equally. That will solve all our problems. And I love this picture because it illustrates in a really clear way what happens when you treat everybody equally. So if you look at the first picture, everybody is standing on an equal platform. Everybody does not have an equal outcome. Everybody's being treated equally, but you still have people who are experiencing barriers that they can't control. They need an ally. That second picture shows what a good ally can do. They are sacrificing something that they have, setting aside their own self-interest, giving the block to the shortest person so that they can see, they can participate. And going even further beyond that, the third picture shows what happens when you remove the bias that caused the problem in the first place. When you remove the wooden fence and replace it with a barrier that doesn't block anybody. So this is one of the things that I like to use when I hear, why can't we just treat everybody equally? Because you know what? Actually, that doesn't help people overcome the barriers that they experience. And it's not what is going to lift our community up to its fullest potential. For the next part of this talk, we're going to go through some really quick ways to act as allies, because it's great to talk for us all to talk about diversity, inclusivity, and being an ally and fighting against bias, but that actually is really hard to do. So we're going to go through some specific tactics and techniques that you can use, and then if we have time, we're going to get into some actual real-world game dev scenarios to talk about how you can be an ally in these situations. So first thing that I want to emphasize is that language really matters. Language is powerful, and acceptable language changes according to the speaker, their audience, and their goals. Relative status changes meaning. And there are things, anybody here have a younger sibling? I would like someone to volunteer one of the most annoying things your younger sibling has ever said to you. I swear I have a point. What?
Don't eat my food.
Don't eat my food. All right, now imagine how you would feel if you were in a meeting and your boss said, don't eat my food. Really weird, right? Like your younger sibling can say things to you that people at work can't because relative status changes meaning. And that's also why there are terms that are not appropriate for people of privilege to use. Relative status changes meaning. And it doesn't matter if you hear other people use that language. If you are in a position of privilege, if you have that relative higher status, it changes meaning. And language matters. Another thing, and this is something actually that was really driven home by a talk that Keith gave for one of our programs. Intent does not equal impact. And this is one of the things that people most often get wrong. This is the cornerstone of the non-apology apology. I didn't mean it that way. I'm really sorry you were offended. Non-apology apology. Because here's the thing, right? Intent does not equal impact. And it's not enough for us to own our intent. It's very rare that we intend to be a bad person. It's very rare that we intend to discriminate, that we intend to create a hostile environment. We also have to own the impact of our words and actions. In fact, the intent is not as relevant as the impact. So if you do something wrong, and guess what, we all will, because we are humans, it's not enough to say, I'm sorry you were offended, I didn't mean it like that. You have to say, I am sorry my actions caused you harm. I am sorry for the impact of what I did. Because at the end of the day, that is far more important than our intent. And if you are going to be a great ally, and I really hope you leave this room committing to be a great ally, if you can remember one thing from this, intent does not equal impact. You have to own your impact. Another thing that is really important when you think about being an ally is understanding the power structures. Because going back to intent and impact and language matters, relative status changes meaning. When you look at a situation, when you think about how to be a good ally, one of the first questions you should ask is who has the power in the relationship? And it gets back to, for example, an interchange that might be acceptable between two siblings at home, but if they're in the office and one sibling is the boss of the other, not okay. Because they are in a different environment. And you know what? The power in your relationship in the office is very different than the power dynamics in your relationship at home. How does relative power impact what's happening? Another thing, understanding bias structures. And this kind of gets back to some of the things that we inadvertently do to perpetuate bias. We collect a lot of information we don't need. So if you think, for example, about how you evaluate a job application, and you think about that example where identical resumes with different names got very, very different responses. When you are doing a first pass at a resume, do you need to know that person's name? No? Do you need to know their address? No. Do you need to know the year that they graduated from whatever school they went to? No. And we know that all of this information actually contributes to making biased decisions because we are humans and we are flawed. And it's not uncommon to say, this person is really old or this person is really young. They don't fit my mental picture of who I think I am going to hire for this role. So one of the things that you can do to impact our bias structures is to remove information that you don't need. Because guess what? When you do that, you have less information that triggers biases. And that's something that you're starting to see more and more companies do. And it's something that's really easy for you to do as you think about how you're hiring people and how you're working with people. take all the names off the resumes. Really simple step. Really easy way to stop yourself from saying, oh, this person doesn't fit my mental image of who I'm going to hire for this role. Another thing about being an ally, because being an ally doesn't just involve business decisions, it also involves how we interact with each other. Agency is absolutely critical. Agency is allowing people to make decisions for themselves. And agency is absolutely required for any consent for physical contact. I hug people, and it's a little bit awkward now because you want to ask before you hug, but that's also a really good thing because there are a lot of people out there who do not want to be hugged by the small American. And that is totally fine because I have to respect their agency. Anytime there's any kind of physical contact, there has to be explicit affirmative consent. Agency isn't just physical contact. I'll give you an example of a time where I was trying to be nice but was a really bad ally. I had someone on my team who was getting ready to have a baby, and we had a big event coming up shortly after she was planning to return from maternity leave. And instead of saying, Shelley, we've got this big conference coming up 2 months after you're coming back from maternity leave, what do you think? Do you want to play it by ear? Do you want to plan to attend? Do you want to plan to stay home? Whatever you want, I will support you. I said, yeah, she's really probably not going to want to travel. Let's plan to send Stephanie instead. Really bad behavior because I diminished her agency just because she had a baby. I was trying to be nice. I had a really good intent. My impact was bias, being a bad ally, diminishing agency. It's really not something that a good ally would do. And it's something, that I have learned from. But it's something that I think really exemplifies a lot of the principles that we talk about. When we think about being an ally, there is no one-size-fits-all answer. When you are acting as an ally in a situation with a friend, compared to acting as an ally when your boss makes a mistake, you're going to take a very different approach. Relative power structure, intent versus impact. You also need to act differently when somebody's physical safety is at risk. There are going to be, if you think about kind of a spectrum of responses, you need to assess intent versus impact. You need to assess relative power structure. You need to assess agency. Is somebody's agency at risk? And urgency. Is there a risk of physical harm? Is there a risk of significant damage? When you act, you can act in that spectrum as well. Coaching. You know what, Jen, you used the word retarded, and I want to let you know that that's not okay. That's not language that we support. Humor. One of my favorite examples in the Allies workshop is asking people what you would do if somebody came up to your colleague who was 8 months pregnant and rubbed their belly and said, oh, you're ready to pop. Right? Has anybody else had that happen? Curious? Yeah, I don't know what it is about having a child. People think that you are suddenly free to be touched. And one of the best responses I heard is for you to go right back to the person that touched the pregnant woman's body and say, wow, what's up with that burrito baby there? Yeah, humor. Also, two wrongs don't necessarily make a right, but humor. And there are times when you can use humor as a way to really drive home that, hey, what you're doing is not okay. Intervention, and also escalation. And particularly, again, when someone's physical safety is at risk, escalation is really important. When somebody is acting in a way that immediately diminishes somebody's standing, it might be that intervention is appropriate, and we'll talk a little bit about that. I also want to share one of my favorite phrases to use as an ally. We don't do that here. And here's why I love we don't do that here. First, it sets the expectation that there is a communal group. We have communal norms, we have communal standards. That we is so important. It's not me saying, I don't really like that, Raylene. It is, we don't do that here. The nice thing about this is that it can also be used in many, many different ways. Jen, you're my new boss, and this is a little bit awkward, but I wanted to let you know when you said that that idea was retarded, we don't do that here. We pay attention to the language we use, especially when it talks about any kind of disability or neurodiversity. Pretty gentle, kind coaching, something that you could probably say to a boss who's a new hire at the company. Compare that to, Jen, that racist joke is not okay. We don't do that here. Very different tone of voice. And really a nice way to kind of reflect that spectrum of intervening as an ally. Whether it's a more gentle, hey, we don't do that here, or a, we don't do that here. So now we're going to go into some scenarios for discussion. Now that we've talked about some of our key principles, intent versus impact, relative power structure, overcoming our biases, acting as an allies. And I'm going to throw some scenarios up, and I'm going to ask you for how you would handle them as an ally. In a meeting, your colleague Grace presents an idea that is ignored. A few minutes later, John presents the same idea, which is met with interest and acclaim. Anybody ever seen or experienced this? Yeah, we start with this one because it happens to everybody. How do you handle this when you're in a meeting? How can you act as a great ally?
Call out the fact that Grace said.
Yeah, John, that's a great point. Grace made it a few minutes earlier. Grace, do you want to expand on that? Yeah, exactly.
Or, I agree, Grace's idea was fantastic. I'm glad you caught on to that.
Yeah, that's also really good. Also really good. Any other ideas on how you might handle this? Mirroring, giving credit, making sure that the person who came up with the original idea, those are all really great tactics to be an ally. Next scenario, and we're going through these pretty quickly, so if you do want to stop again, just raise your hand. You're speaking with your colleague Amy, who has recently had her hair done. Another colleague approaches, touches Amy's hair, and then compliments the new style. Yeah. How would you be a good ally in this situation?
Don't touch my hair, please just don't do that.
Yeah.
Please don't touch the person's hair. Or if you would like to ask them questions like, oh, I saw you got your hair done. How was that? It looks great. How did you get it done? Opening with a question it builds a rapport. It also doesn't invade the personal space of the person who you're talking to.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else somebody might do in this situation? Yeah, that hits it. And it can be awkward if it is, say, your boss who is coming in and touching Amy's hair. And you might use humor, but you might also say, like, hey, Jen, that was kind of weird. You just touched Amy's hair without asking. That's not okay. And one of the things that's really important to keep in mind here is relative power structures, right? So if somebody is watching an interaction with colleagues and someone senior in the company does something and nobody calls that out, what it does is it sends the implicit message that it is okay. And this is really hard. Being an ally is really hard. It is hard to call your boss out. And there are ways to do it where maybe afterwards you go into your boss's office and say, hey, when you touched Amy's hair, it made me feel really uncomfortable because you didn't ask for permission. And I know I wouldn't be okay if somebody came up and touched my hair. That's maybe a gentler way of bringing that up. But when we don't stop and talk about it, when we don't bring this up, even when it's a really hard conversation and a really awkward conversation, the behavior continues. And if it's behavior being done by somebody in power, that sends the message to anyone observing that the behavior is okay, and it's not. And this is a good example of a time when it is really hard to be an ally because you are sacrificing your self-interest. No one likes telling their boss that they're wrong. Most people don't like telling their boss that they're wrong. You're sacrificing your own self-interest, but you are doing it in service not just to Amy, but to everybody who doesn't like being touched without consent. Here is a really important thing to discuss. A colleague who you knew as Jessica has announced that they are transitioning. They now want to be known as J, and that their pronouns are they and them. Later, another colleague consistently refers to J using feminine pronouns. What do you do?
Correct them with every chance.
Yeah. And how would their reaction impact your next steps?
If they immediately apologize and correct themselves,
Mhm.
and I'd politely encourage them. But if they continue to misgender J, then I would more forcefully bring it up and be like, we don't do that here.
Yes. And that is such a great response because we have mental shortcuts. And if you know somebody before they transition, even if you try hard, sometimes you might make a mistake. And so that reaction, I do see your hand, that reaction, thank you for correcting me, they did such great work on this project, is a really important indicator of intent versus impact, and how to be a good ally both to Jay, but also to your friend who wants to do better. If they continue to deliberately misgender Jay, then that's when you may need to take on escalation. And you might need to go to somebody else, to go to HR if it's at work, for example, and say, look, I'm not comfortable with this. Jay has a right to agency to decide their identity. And when our colleague refuses to respect that, I'm not okay with it.
My point was exactly that. It's not necessarily your responsibility to have to be the one taking that fight. There should always be something in the way for you to go and take advantage of escalation and have someone else come in and deal with the situation.
Yep. Yeah, escalation can be a really important tool in your ally toolkit. Absolutely. This next example is a real-life example that was shared by Osama Dorius at his talk at GDC. Did anybody see Osama's talk on Muslim representation? Yeah, it's really good. You can see it on YouTube or in the GDC vault, and I highly recommend it. You're talking about new concept art for a game with two colleagues. One of them suggests the villain be Muslim. Your colleague Osama starts to object and is told, "This isn't about you, Osama. You're one of the good ones." Yeah, yeah. How do you handle that?
Possibly put the reflection back on, if, if one of them suggests the villain maybe was, put the reflection back on, okay, well, if this isn't about him, well, maybe it's about you.
Yeah, that's really
Turn the
good.
reflection back on them. If they're trying to objectify or villainize somebody else, or make them the villain in it and go, well, this isn't about you, you're one of the good ones.
Yeah. No, Jen, actually it's about you and that really racist statement you just made that I'm not okay with. Yeah, what else could you do here?
Could you point out that by making that statement, they're implying that the others are the bad ones?
Yeah, that's also a really great, like, hey, this is how your statement comes off. It makes you sound like you're a really racist, bad person.
I think somebody like that would benefit from, like, if you give them just a few things to educate them. They actually need to be educated on the statistics and that sort of thing. You can't just say, we don't do that. They need to actually learn.
Yeah. This is also, to me, a really good example of times when escalation and intervention might be appropriate. So if that happens in a work meeting, say it happens in a design meeting, stopping the meeting and saying, wait a minute, this makes me really uncomfortable. I don't think we can continue this work discussion because this interaction is not okay, is totally legitimate. And it's hard to do. It's hard to be the person that says, whoa, 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 not all right. But in a situation like this, it is a really powerful way to act as an ally. And it also helps drive home the impact of Osama's colleague's statement. The impact was so severe, so significant, that the intent was probably not terrible, but the impact is so egregious that you have to stop it. Another more difficult situation. Your company is hosting a social event at GDC or at GCAP. A coworker approaches you and says they are being harassed by another colleague. What do you do?
Immediately remove both of them
Yep.
and then escalate it, unless you are the person to whom it would be escalated, at which point you start actually proceeding.
Yep.
Probably the following day.
Intervention, super, super important. You have to stop the situation immediately. What else would you do? Okay.
You ask the coworker that's being harassed
Oh, dear.
if there's something they would like you to do, sort of give them agency over the outcome.
Yeah, really important there. Anything else?
Make sure you have a safer spaces policy in place and follow the procedures, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, hello. And it was all going so well up to now, too. So here's something that's really important. If you are involved in any kind of event, have your policy for how you will respond to a harassment complaint ready long before the event happens. The IGDA has a harassment complaint policy. We post it. It's available under our resources section. You are welcome to use it or amend it as you like. But it is really important that you know how you're going to handle this problem before it happens. Another thing that is also really important, if somebody comes to you and says they are being harassed, no matter who it is, do not leave that person alone, because you don't know if their physical safety might be at risk. There are ways to handle it. You can say, Chad, is there someone I can find to come stay with you? Is there somebody you'd like to be with you? But instead of trying to go off and get the person who is doing the harassing, first and foremost, ensure the safety of everybody involved. Stay with the person who's making the complaint. Notify event security. That's really important as well. And then, when it is appropriate, escalate. So start that policy for investigating the complaint, for taking action. But no matter what, always, always, always prioritize the physical safety of people involved. And don't leave them alone. Here's an interesting one that is not quite as serious and more common in the games industry. Or maybe not. Technical difficulties, certainly more common in the games industry. Okay. A colleague, Aubrey, is presenting a new strategy at work. You know, Blake made a significant contribution to the strategy, but their name is nowhere to be found in the presentation. Anybody ever have that happen to them? Yeah, you do work and you don't receive credit for it. So what would you like an ally to do in that situation? How do you want an ally to act?
Make sure you make it known that they have contributed to the team.
How would you do that? What would you say in this meeting?
I'd be saying also let's not forget this also helps their hard work to get what it is. If you know exactly what you've done.
Yeah. Yep, that's great. Any other ideas for how you could act as a guide?
Kind of similar to the first or second example, like saying, oh, can you explain what Blake did with that function? You know, something like that.
Yeah. Yep, making sure Blake's contributions get recognized. Here's a really interesting one as well. You're talking with a senior leader at the company about a possible new role, which comes with a promotion for someone on your team. You suggest Jenny, but they respond that she hasn't really shown that she can handle those new responsibilities. Later, they ask about Joe, who really seems to have a lot of potential. Any idea what's going on here and what you might want to do?
You ask them to quantify it first.
And what's the underlying reason?
No, surface level it's sexism.
Yeah.
But it may not be. So ask them what's led you to believe about Jenny, what's led you to believe about Joe.
Yeah, and that's a great way of looking at the bias structure itself, right?
It may be that a previous issue, which has also come from a bias, is that Jenny hasn't been given opportunities to improve herself, whereas Joe's been given tasks that he can improve himself with.
Exactly. Harvard Business Review did a study that shows that women are more likely to be promoted after they have shown they can meet the requirements of the new job Men are more likely to be promoted because of perceived potential. And so your comment was exactly right. On the face of it, it looks like there's two different ways of assessing Jenny and Joe here. Asking, what is it about Jenny that makes you think she hasn't really shown she can handle those responsibilities? What is it about Joe that makes you think that he has a lot of potential? And this is also important because often in work, at least I have seen it, where someone who is maybe louder in meetings or talks more with the right people or uses the right buzzwords can get promoted more quickly. Anybody see that? Yeah, maybe? When you look at the behaviors and the skills that you are promoting for and create objectives, that helps to remove a bias structure. It's kind of like taking the names off of the resume. Let's not talk about Jenny and Joe. Let's talk about what this person and that person have done. Let's talk about how that maps to the new position. And let's talk about how we can, in as objective a way as possible, assess who's the better fit for the new opportunity. This is an interesting one. Your team just finished a major project and you'd like to reward them with an offsite day. Gabriel suggests a wine tasting and cooking class at a local winery. Max recommends an all-day hike at a local national park. You've got kind of a funny face there.
On one hand, Gabriel's suggesting the wine tasting and cooking class. Kind of like, are there people in the team that don't drink alcohol, and wouldn't enjoy that as much, but also with Max's recommendation of the all-day hike, are there people in the team that have mobility issues and going on an all-day hike would be strenuous for them?
So here's a question. Will you know whether there are people on your team for whom either one of these activities would be a problem?
I would like to.
Would you feel comfortable saying, yes, I know that for people on my team, whether or not these activities would be a problem? Definitively, yes, I would know. So I picked these examples deliberately, right? Because if you were to say to somebody like, hey, Keith, we're talking about going to a winery, you drink alcohol, right? That's really awkward. Because it might be that, and this will be the last example, that I'm on medication and I don't want to disclose that to my boss. It might be that I'm expecting. It might be that I just don't like how I act when I drink. And I don't want to talk to my boss about that.
There's also the assumption that we're in the games industry.
Yes, and so much of what we do socially seems to revolve around alcohol, and that's a real problem. It can be a really isolating factor for someone who doesn't drink. And asking someone if they drink is really not appropriate for a colleague to ask. On the other hand, an all-day hike, you mentioned mobility issues, and you might be able to see that, but I have Crohn's disease. And Crohn's disease is an inflammatory bowel disease. And what that means is that if I was having a flare and you were going to tell me that I would be spending a day out in nature with my colleagues where there are no bathrooms around, I would have a sick day that day. I don't necessarily want to talk about my bathroom habits with my boss, even though I've just did it with a room full of strangers. But you can see how that's something that might be really awkward, and that you may not want to disclose to your boss that you have a chronic illness. You would never guess to look at me that I wouldn't want to do an all-day hike if I was having a flare. I don't look like I have mobility issues. But there might be something going on there that would mean that I wouldn't feel included in the offsite. And at the end of the day, we don't want to do that, right? We want to recognize our team for being wonderful. We don't want to inadvertently. Our intent is good, but the impact might be very different. And we are out of time. Maybe we could take a question or comment if anybody had one, but otherwise, did you have? Otherwise, I hope that you found this interesting. I hope that you're taking away something, remember intent does not equal impact. Remember that we are all biased and we all need each other's help. So let's all do our best to help each other out there. Thank you.